Where's the big bad wolf? Yeah, I know it's supposed to be who's afraid of the big bad wolf, but in this episode that I just had with Jill Hackman, we actually talked about what it looks like to write a fairy tale retelling using Little Red Riding Hood, which is a less commonly retold fairy tale. We dug into what it looks like to work with less commonly retold fairy tale retellings. We talked about the reasons why something might be more popular or less popular. We discussed what it looks like to mesh science fiction and fairy tales together, and her process that she did that with in her newest release, All the Wild Hearts. We had some really great discussions as well about the difference between hard and soft sci-fi and how that compares with fantasy. And make sure you go to the end of the episode because we dropped some really fun things at the end about how you can really succeed in this particular genre and genre mashup. Real quick, make sure that you hit that subscribe button on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you're listening to this podcast. And sit tight because we are going to have a fantastic time hanging out with the amazing J.M. Hackman, also known as Jill. This is the Author Culture Podcast. Let's chat. So fairy tale retellings have had a resurgence that started back in 2013, and everyone was like, oh, this must be a trend, especially in trad publishing, where you started seeing a decent amount of fairy retellings there. You started seeing things with the Lunar Chronicles, and everyone was like, oh, this must just be coming around and then it's going to disappear. But what we found is that it actually hasn't disappeared. It hasn't been a trend. It has had steady popularity and has done especially well in multi-author series lately. You see a lot of anthologies and multi-author series built around adapting fairy tales. So Jill, why do you think fairy tales have relevance in the modern world? Why is this sticking around?
I think we know what to expect. There's a structure. You know the fairy tales. You know Cinderella. You know Beauty and the Beast. But the structure allows you to get in there and change things. And that's part of the joy of seeing how did this author take it and twist it? What did they make different? Where are the elements of this, where are the common elements you find? And so I think that, are they relevant today? I just think that they're relevant, they're evergreen, because everyone wants that happy ending, especially with the way the world is now. They want that happy ending. You want the happy ending. You want to see what they did differently with this fairy tale. It's just the joy of experiencing. There's going to be, there should be a happy ending, and you know what's going to happen. And I think that's part of the fun of it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There's a sort of universality of them, especially since a lot of fairy tales at their core are folklore, and so they deal with pretty simple concepts. So in the case of your book, which we'll be talking about later, you're talking about a little girl in a red cloak going to the woods to give food to her grandmother. Pretty simple structure, which means you can adapt it to a lot of things. It doesn't have a lot of extra baggage or requirements on it, right?
Right. I mean, it was originally, it was a morality tale, really, is what it was,
Mm-hmm.
And I did research and found out that it was told at a time whenever they were young, impressionable, pretty girls going to King Louis XIV's court. And this was a warning. Beware of the wolves in the court because they like young, pretty, impressionable girls. And so that was kind of where it all started. And I was like, what can we do with that? So,
yeah, I love that. And again, that also, I think, points to not just the desire for a happy ending, but kind of the knowledge that we live in a world where those don't always happen. We live in a world where dark things happen, where there are monsters that don't always look like monsters. Mm-hmm. And you have to deal with them. And so how do you have these simple stories that are going to serve to warn people about the dangers out there, about the wolves, about the things that they have to be careful about, which sometimes means you have to go, oh, we're not as worried about that thing as you were 1,000 years ago.
True.
We're worried about different things now, but it definitely has that same relevance, I would say. And then as a Christian myself, the idea of, we live in a fallen world, there's brokenness, you need to be careful. There is not, we hope for a fairy tale, but also we have plenty of wicked stepmothers and people who treat people terribly, and you need to be careful about that.
Right.
Fairy tales are often set in contemporary or fantasy setting these days. So you see a lot of secondary world settings. You sometimes see them in urban fantasy, and you see them adapted into contemporary settings with no magic, just, finding ways to take any magical or mythical elements and make them fit into a contemporary world. But your recent release, All the Wild Hearts, is a retelling of Little Red Riding Hood set in a science fiction world. What inspired you to choose this particular setting? Was there a book series, a movie?
Well, I love Lunar Chronicles. I loved that. I had actually read I think it was the pitch letter that Marissa Meyer?
Yeah. Marissa Meyer, yep.
Yeah. I just blanked out.
It's all good, yeah.
You wrote that? So, yeah, I read her pitch story, and she had said it was a futuristic fantasy, and I was like, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. Well, I didn't intend to be as sci-fi as it is. It's going to be fantasy, and it just didn't. As I was writing it, it was becoming more and more high-tech and less fantasy, but I really wanted to keep that magic in there, which makes it fantasy. And I don't do well with, hey, let's put in a different planet where they have to wear spacesuits and, we have to worry about gravity and oxygen. I'm like, no, it's going to be an Earth-based, an Earth-like solar system. And with many habitable planets. I mean, I just kind of threw it all in there. But I really wanted to keep the magic. And I even had an early reader go, it doesn't really blend very well. And I'm like, okay.
Yeah.
I'm doing the best I can here. And it was after we watched Ahsoka. And I don't know if you watched that one, but there's this. She's a witch, basically, is what she is. One of the. I'm sorry if I just spoiled it for everybody who hasn't seen it yet, but there's this witch, and she actually creates. I don't know. It was strange. She actually kind of like threw up her hands, and the whole solar system like pops up with all the constellations. Like, that is cool, and that's when it clicked for me. That's it. So I thought, okay, we need to have an energy or a magic or some kind of force that is based on the stars. And that's what tied it all in for me. So I give props to the people who wrote Ahsoka to help me with my inspiration. So, but yeah, Lunar Chronicles was a big influence on that. So
I love that. And I love how you really are trying to sort of bridge that sort of gap between things that we see as very mythical, magical folklore, and then things that are sci-fi and tech. In a recent episode I just did, I was commenting how in Star Wars, it seems like in some ways they're pulling away from that. But I always found it interesting with Star Wars, how they have that mythical energy going on. And yeah, is it completely hard? No, but also like a lot of things that we take for granted as plausible wouldn't have been thought of as plausible 100 years ago. Like scientists from 100 years ago would have laughed their heads off at what we consider plausible, and they wouldn't have figured out AI at all. Like they wouldn't have seen any of this coming. And so sometimes the plausibility argument, I'm like, really? But isn't that a little bit from your perspective? And I like that you included both a lot of science fiction elements, and you do rename things a lot. So it's definitely a bit of a secondary world concept. You have different ways they make food, for example. But then you also do have some of that energy magic, sort of, quote unquote, which is slightly a cheat. I know some people are going to go, that's a cheat. And I'm like, you know what? It's a fun cheat. And if you make it coherent within your story, then we're okay with that. And so that's a really fun way of handling it.
Well, I just thought it was important because when you think about it, there are things that occur now that we consider wonder or we don't have explanations for. So why would it be any different? In another world, another solar system, there's still going to be things that are, wondrous that they don't understand, can't explain. And so I thought magic's not going to go away. It's still going to be there because there are things that happen here that are considered magical or unusual or different. So I was just like, no, we need to have both. So
yeah, I love that. Now, here's the thing. You and I have known each other for a bit, a number of years here and there. And this isn't your first novel, or in this case, novella. How did you first get started as an author in the publishing industry?
I graduated from Penn State with a degree in elementary ed. And after I did that, I realized, no, I don't want to teach. So that was a mistake on my part. And so I started writing as soon as I graduated. And I wrote for a long, long time. I wrote Christian romance to start, and then got disgusted with how you couldn't say anything because, we can't talk about heat and we can't talk about, there was a lot of things we couldn't talk about that I thought were kind of important because it's part of falling in love. And then I had children and I couldn't think of anything because I had children. And then after they were, had been, doing whatever it is they're doing and they went to school, that's when my time kind of freed up a little bit. And I started writing, and Harry Potter had come on the scene in the meantime. And I was like, Harry Potter. So I started writing speculative fantasy. And I wrote that for a while. And I pitched and nothing happened. I was like, I don't know. And so I started writing Spark, which is the first one in my Portal Fantasy trilogy. And that went through a lot of changes because, again, raising children while trying to write is very difficult. So I had written a short story that was called The Escort, and I submitted to a contest. And I actually won Editor's Choice. And that enabled me, the part of the award was being able to go to the Railmakers Conference, which they have every year. And at the Railmakers Conference, I pitched Spark, and it was picked up by a small press. For me, that was a door opening that I didn't want to miss. And it was a good experience. I'm glad I did it. Yeah, so that's kind of how it started. I took advantage of the opportunities I had. And like I said, I think that contests are the way to go, really, because it gets you in front of other people. It gives you opportunities. You win things, which is always good. And, but it gave me the opportunity to go to the Railmakers Conference, and that's where it all opened up for me. So,
And of course, now you're ended up in the indie world, which is like, yay. And as someone, I mean, I did run a publishing house for myself for 7 years, and it did well. But then economies happen, and it becomes very difficult. And I've said over and over again on this podcast how the traditional model is difficult to maintain, especially for smaller presses. And books, which I love and I believe in, especially fiction books, but in a tight economy, they're often seen as, some people say discretionary, some people say commodity-based things. They're not paying your rent. They're not paying your mortgage. So you can't eat them. And as much as we say passionately, yes, but it's more important than food. And I go, we say that. I like food.
Yeah, it's true.
So
it feels superfluous.
So indie, I mean, we always have libraries where we can get books for free, which is wonderful. But also the indie world is a lot of work, but it can open doorways for that sometimes you just can't find in traditional houses. And I think more and more that is a thing.
Yeah, there's definitely gatekeepers that say, no, we're not going to publish this. Change this. And I'm like, no, it's written that way for a reason.
Yeah. Yep. And that's the way it goes when you're trying to increasingly try to create a brand in a very tight area. But it doesn't give that time for indies to explore. And so I'm excited that you get to explore with this.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's learning. I've learned a lot. So
now, since you started off in YA portal fantasy in a secondary world. So portal fantasy, for those who aren't aware, is where the main character starts out in our contemporary world or something similar. You can have historical portal fantasy where they start off in a world that's historically earlier than ours, but they're still hopping over to a fantasy world or to maybe a different time period. But that is a different angle than fairy tale retellings. So what inspired you to go from YA portal fantasy to fairy tales? Have you written other fairy tales?
I have. There's 3 anthologies I can think of. The first one was, the first one I believe was through...
Was it Fellowship of Fantasy?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're good.
That one was, the first one was... it was the Mythical Doorways, I think, which really wasn't actually a fairy tale. But it was fae. It was fae based. So, but most of the stories I write end up sounding kind of fairy tale-esque anyway, because they're in other worlds and there are, Anyway, the second one was the Once Upon a Time Fellowship of Fantasy one. And they were fairy tales, but also original fairy tales, not retellings. There were, you could do either, and mine was not. It was actually it was based back on. I think that was the one that was connected to the portal fantasy. It actually, it was linked to that, and then I have the one that I did with a bunch of friends of mine, which was called Encircled, and that one, that was the best experience I've ever had because it was 5-6 people, and you'd think there would be a lot of infighting. There was none. Everybody took on a job. We printed it. It was the most fun I've ever had producing anything. It was a lot of fun. It was a really good experience. I would love to do it again, but we're all in different spots of our lives now, and it's almost impossible to get together again. But it was a good experience, and I'd love to do it again. But that was kind of where it started, and I was like, I like this. And I get bored easily. And I had done I released Spark in 2015, 16, and the box set was released in 2020. It had taken me 6 years to write Spark. I was done. I was like, I want something different. And so to write the fairy tale, to go that route, to do a retelling was enjoyable, exciting, different. So that's kind of where it started. I was just like, I want something different. So.
I love that. And so that is a great place to start from, and having that great experience with fairy tale retellings is good. Now, moving back around to your sci-fi fairy tale novella, All the Wild Hearts, which just came out recently as of this recording. I believe it came out about a week or two ago.
29th. The 29th, I think.
29th of April. So yeah, a couple weeks ago. With this one, you chose to retell Little Red Riding Hood. And Little Red Riding Hood isn't as commonly adapted as, say, Cinderella or Beauty and the Beast. And I do have some thoughts that I mentioned to you when we were talking about this pre-recording, where we were mentioning a lot of times fairy tale retellings go hand in hand with clean or sweet romance. Or on the other side, you do actually see them showing up with steamy romance. Not as much. I don't see that as much as with the clean, but with clean romance and fairy tale retellings, those tend to go hand in hand. And Little Red Riding Hood is a fairly difficult book to romance because it is very much, as we mentioned earlier in this episode, a warning story about falling for the wrong guy, or a warning story about, being seduced or those kind of things, or being taken advantage of in some way. So why choose this book versus something like Cinderella?
Well, this was actually a second book I had written in the series. I had written the first one first, which was Snow White, and that's coming. It's not here yet. I mean, it's written, it's done, it's edited, but it needs to be, fixed, and that'll probably be released next year. This one, so I wrote a second, and I was like, well, what hasn't been retold? It's like exactly what you said, what hasn't been retold? And I thought, well, people don't really talk about Red Riding Hood very much. And granted, the original, she's like, I don't know, like 6, and she's, little. And I was like, now we're going to have her be older, but still face that predatory, male. And so, it does deal with sexual harassment. I try not to make it too creepy, and someone said, yeah, you did a good job. It doesn't, go into the giggly weeds too much with that. But there is some of that, because that's basically what the story is. She's being stalked. So I did it but it's not told a lot. And a lot of the ones that are out there, I was like looking online. Oh my word. Some of the stuff is like really, it's steamy. It's hot. It's not clean. It's just so obviously not really what I would want others to read. And this was cleaner. It still touches on sexual harassment. But yeah, I picked it because it wasn't told a lot, and I wanted something a little unique, a little different. And and like I said, the structure was wide open. There was a lot of room to play.
I think because even when you try to handle it very tastefully, the very concept of any kind of sexual harassment of any kind just has, as it should. Like, I think when people have kind of that squeamish feeling, we should be squeamish. That's our gut and our intuition, our conscious saying, this is not right. This is creepy. Don't do this.
Yeah.
That is a God-given warning. You don't, no, back away. Leave the room. We're good with that. But because of that, and because of people being a little sensitive to that in some fiction circles where they don't really go into much things, it's hard to have that content in there and to handle it well. So kudos to you for going for that. I've really loved how you play it out so far. Haven't finished it, but I really enjoyed just how you've woven things in and how you're just facing that in the story.
Thanks.
Now, doing a sci-fi mashup does have some precedent because of the Lunar Chronicles. When you have a story, a series like that just goes big and then stays perennially popular, that does help create an entryway for other people saying, I'm also going to do this. But it is fairly unusual still. After all, often fairy tales naturally use fairy tale magic, which leads to fantasy. And you mentioned having to kind of use some energy-based things in there from Star Wars. So we're okay with this. Like, we're going to be okay with this. But what else did you have to research or deal with when adapting Little Red Riding Hood into a sci-fi context? I know you said you kind of just found yourself in that place. But once you found yourself there and you found yourself thinking about those questions, what was something where you're like, wow, I'm having to think about something that my friends who are writing fantasy, like straight up fantasy, don't have to think about when dealing with this?
Okay, I'm not sciencey. I don't, that's not my thing. I'm like, it works. That's all I need to know. But when you're writing sci-fi, even if it's soft sci-fi, you have to think, okay, what don't we have and what would we want in a world like that? And I was like one of the concepts I used was it's a item called a restore screen, which is basically just something you put on a wound to keep it from keep from bleeding out and to just kind of heal it. And I was like, this is awesome. And I was talking to my dermatologist, and she's like, yeah, that already exists. I'm like, okay. Okay. All right. Well, that is a good thought, So there's that kind of thing where I have to think, and it's not something I'm really naturally good at. What do we need? What don't we have? And that was something, you can't just magic something up. It's got to be something that actually would make sense in the world. How would it work, and does it work? That was hard for me to actually kind of come up with things that don't exist, and what we would need. I mean, like the flying cars, everybody wants that. Ever since Back to the Future, we've been waiting on them. So that wasn't hard, but other things were difficult to try to make it unique, different, something we haven't seen before. And that's just a constant struggle for this whole series, to just kind of make things that are unique and different. And yeah, so.
And what I found lately with that you do some, and I've seen it happen more in some Star Wars things as well, is it used to be a thing where your science fiction writers were very much futurists. Mm-hmm. And they were just trying to always think 10 steps ahead in the future, which is why, when Star Trek came out, especially the Next Generation, they had pads. Well, now I don't think they realized that in 15 years we would have iPads.
Right.
Everyone would have like tablets that they're like, oh, look, it's a tablet computer. And now we all have them. So I think people are now kind of giving up, and they're sort of, instead of going retro future, they're going retro sideways. And they're saying, okay, we're not going to think about ahead of the game, because that just goes to holographs, and there's only so much you can do with holographs. But we have so much with tactile computers these days that, the next stage is just holographs, which we still no one's really figured out how to manipulate them still. I don't think it's a huge priority for techies right now, and that's okay with me. But I've seen people more of saying, okay, how do we just secondary world this and go sideways? How do we do this differently? Not trying to look better, not trying to always improve, because then the culture catches up and then we look dated. We're just going to go off in this end. What would it look done differently instead of done like super advanced? Because it can be a little exhausting sometimes to try to keep ahead of that.
Right. That's exactly what I was facing. I'm like, I can't make this any better. Like you said, you go to holographs, and there is that in the book, but you can't just keep saying, well, it's holographs. There's got to be other things that are occurring that are different or unique that we haven't seen before. So
now, this probably dovetails into the previous question, but I'll ask it anyway. What did you find most challenging about the actual writing of this retelling? So we talked about the sci-fi thing a bit, and we talked about the world building part, which I love, because world building is my jam. But was there anything else that you said, I have to do this, or I want to do this, but how do I do this? Or something where you got some pushback from beta readers, or things where you had to rethink how you were doing things. Was that an area for you to deal with in this book?
There weren't a lot of beta readers, although I did have a few. And most of them were on board with what I had written. I did go back to the source material. A lot of people are like, ooh, what Disney say? I'm like, no, Disney is a retelling in itself. You can't, I know there are people that do that. I don't think that's a fair representation of the fairy tale, because they are retellings. So I went back to the source material, and there are several versions of it. And there's the version where she goes to Grandma's house, and Grandma's a wolf, and she gets eaten, and that's the end. And then there's another one where the woodsman shows up, and he cuts the wolf open and saves her and Grandma both. And I was like, okay, we're not doing the woodsman, but there's got to be a hero. There's got to be a hero. There's the villain. The villain's obvious. Who's the hero? And that was something I kind of played around with. I'm like, it would have to be somebody. And I'm old school. I think it's got to be someone who saves her. I know the Snow White is not the Snow White retelling. I have a problem with the one that just went live action, because there is no hero really. I mean, he's a thief. He's not a hero. He doesn't. Yeah, he saves her, but I don't know. I think your heroes should be worth being a hero. I think they should be somebody that you kind of go, yeah, that's somebody that I'd want to spend time with. He's got to be gentlemanly, or that sounds old fashioned. He's got to be a good person. That's what it has, and that's what I wanted. So I thought, okay, this guy's got to be a good person, and he is, but he's got a past that is just lousy. And then of course when you start writing that, then okay, we've got a redemption arc here, and that's even more exciting to actually write that in. So it was kind of a organic thing. I wasn't really like planning, okay, we got this guy and this guy. It just kind of happened, and I was really happy with how it ended up, and I really ended up really liking the hero. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's an important distinction, is that yes, you want a hero to actually be heroic in some way. And I think also you want them to have a sense of conviction in a sense of having their own purpose, but also it's okay for them to be flawed because we're all flawed. And you can do a Superman style hero, like Superman being a bit of a Boy Scout, and that's fine. I would say one of Superman's biggest things is a little bit of naivety. Sometimes, like, he always deals with these trickster types or stuff, or devious Lex Luthor that he never catches his next plan, because the one thing Lex Luthor does that he doesn't do is, think like a villain and get and trick him. But you do want to have that complexity a bit, because everyone has a little bit of complexity. Even people who haven't had a bad childhood, there's still something. No one had a perfect childhood. Those things can shape us in positive ways.
Right.
Or in ways that have growth in the story, which is also helpful.
Plus, it's more interesting to read if you have a character
it's way
with
more
complexity.
interesting to read. Yeah.
That's what you want to read. People read for characters. They don't read for, and that's the problem I have with hard sci-fi. That like, look at this cool gadget. I'm like, no, we want to know about the characters. What are the characters doing? What are special about them? That's why people read. They don't read. Some people read for the gadgets.
Yeah, I mean, the hard sci-fi exists for a reason. And
right. But Kathy Tyers writes sci-fi. And she's amazing, because it was the first time I had come across somebody who was writing sci-fi where they also focused on characters. And I was like, that right there is what I wanted. I wanted characters that were interesting, that were, flawed, and also had good aspects, but that also were in a world that was very unique and unusual, And I'm not saying all sci-fi is bad. I mean, I read, which one was it? Carrie Nietzsche's Amish Vampires in Space, which I know people are like, oh, that book, but it's fun and it's good. He did a good job with it. It was hard sci-fi, but it was done well, and so I was like, oh, it can be done. It doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be hard and what's the word? I don't know. It just kind of sounds like it's removed. It's remote because it's not so much about the characters as it is about other things. And he did a good job of actually drawing you in with the characters and making it interesting. Yeah. So,
and I think that's the interesting thing with science fiction, is that whereas in fantasy there are a lot of different sub genres that are very clear and you kind of know what to expect. So if someone says an epic fantasy, you're going to know, okay, we're going to have a cast of 20 characters. We're going to have a million plot lines. We may not get as individually invested in them because there's 20 of them, but the expectations. And there is epic hard sci-fi. I think I would call the Expanse series, which I'm slowly working through, these giant thick books and this huge scale of planets. But there's not as many sort of labels for it or categories for it. I don't see as much of that. And so I think because of that, it can just be, you're really charting a new frontier with that. And I think it used to, purely my thoughts here, but I think it used to be a thing where if you wanted any of that, you would go to space opera or fantasy. That's where you found that stuff. You found all that character stuff over there. Sci-fi, just, over there. At the end of the day, some people just want to sit down and deal with the tech. That is relaxing for them, and I respect that. And I can be in that place sometimes. But I think now the sci-fi genre, I would say especially because of indies, has broken open a lot more, because people are kind of realizing, hey, I can do different things with this. And then you get some pushback, people going, but we liked our hard sci-fi. Go away. Go over there. Shoo. And so it's been interesting to see that work. And I think fairy tale retellings, again, are a great way to kind of get into that, because, again, you have the structure. And so you're going into it with a structure. You're not going into it trying to say, okay, I'm trying to mash up these genres, but how do I do that? You're going, I'm going to take this and I'm going to put it over here. And we're going to see how that works and how that fleshes out. So we've talked a lot about the challenges with this one, but what did you find most rewarding about writing this retelling? What just made you go, love this?
I'll be honest, it was the characters. I am totally Team Blaze on this. He's a sweetheart, and it was the characters for me. Like I said before, you're taking fantasy but also sci-fi and putting them together. And I was like, okay, how can I wanted to have something magical. And I was like, okay, she's got a gift. And guess what? He does too. I was like, we're going to give them both unique things. And I guess I can go ahead and say, what his gift was, because that kind of shows up early. He's kind of like a semi-shifter, sort of, without the shifting. And so he's got that other character inside him, which was a lot of fun to write. So I would say that it was he was the most fun to write because of his shifter, semi-shifter augmentation he's got inside him. I've read some shifter stories of variable heat levels. It's hard to find clean shifter stories. But I read some, and they were extremely funny to have that other consciousness or other personality inside. And so that was a lot of fun to write. I enjoyed him thoroughly. So
I love that. And I was looking through some of the reviews, and people mentioned, like, it reminded me of Jupiter Ascending, or it reminded me of this thing or that thing.
I've never seen that movie. I've never seen that.
It's one of my favorites. It's kind of, if you have a taste for things like The Fifth Element or stuff, it's kind of that strange level of crazy out there. We're really doing this kind of thing. But they did have a character in there who they call it genome engineering. And so they just splice their DNA with animals. And so they had one that DNA was spliced with bees, and one that their DNA is spliced with wolves.
I need to I need to watch this.
Watch it. Yeah, it is unique. It's a bit of a hot mess. Don't think about a lot of why nothing nothing makes sense if you think about it for 2 seconds. It really doesn't. But it is an absolute hoot if you can just look at it the same way you look at something crazy like The Fifth Element or something, where you're just like, none of this, doesn't make sense, but it's just fun. And it has some interesting things to say about what people value once you have so much money. The big thing everyone is chasing in this movie is time, and how to reduce aging, and being willing to go to very extreme lengths to do that. And I think that was a very interesting concept that came out of it, as well as the concept of how we relate to other people in our lives in terms of as a family and generationally. So worth it, we'll say. Again, it's PG-13. I think there's a couple of kisses, so it's mostly for violence and some of some references and such. So it's not really a romance the way that you would, like, there's no fade to blacks even or that. It's like, it moves. So if you're the kind of person that you're like, oh, I only watch a certain level, it is PG-13 for a reason. But it is interesting, and it is fun, and it is a hot mess. So give it a shot.
Who's the lead? Who's the male lead?
What's his name? He
was it
Step
Was it a Hemsworth?
No, it was not a Hemsworth. He's in Step Up, and he was in Big Square Face. Channing Tatum. I think it's Channing Tatum.
All right. Yeah. Okay.
Pretty sure. I'll have to I'm going to double check that now just to make sure. But yeah, and yeah,
Big Square Face.
Yeah.
I just heard what you said.
Yeah, big square face, like the jaw that could like smash through walls, kind of thing, kind of square jaw, classic hero type. Yeah. But slight side quest there. But it is an interesting movie, and again, there's just not as many movies, I think, that go into sci-fi exploring those kind of things. It's something that kind of
expensive to make. That's why.
That's what I mean. Like, especially when you're talking about movies. When you're talking about books, the world building is intense. You can't do hand wavium as much with sci-fi. You can try, but people buy it less than in fantasy, where you can do a lot more because magic, sparkles.
Yeah, sparkles.
But sci-fi just doesn't tolerate that as much. So even the softer stuff, you have to do a little more work. And then, of course, if you're going to put sci-fi on the big screen, your special effects budget just has to be way higher, or you have to try to make it very hard sci-fi so that you don't have all that expensive technology that you have to create, or visual effects. So you have to consider that. Now, what's one piece of advice that you would give authors about writing sci-fi fairy tale retellings?
Well, I've got two pieces.
Okay.
The one is just to writers in general, and that is to not give up. I wrote for, it seems like forever. I wrote for many, many years with no sign of anything happening. And so you have to love it. You have to love it to do this. Don't do it for money. Don't do it because you want to see your name in lights. Do it because you love it. And don't give up, because you're, like I said, you might do it for a long time. I've had people say, oh, I've written for 2 books already and nothing's happened. How long do I have to do this? A long time. You have to do it for a long time. The second piece in regards to fairy tale retellings, I would say would be to honor the source material. There are people out there who are, what is the source material? Where did you get it? What are you retelling from? Because when I had done the Encircled, there was a review where she actually had gone back and said, this, of all of them, this one is the most true to the source material. And it was important to her. It was a long review, and she was like, this is important because of XYZ. And so I would say be very careful where you're getting your source, your source material from, and try to make it as, be as honest as you can with it, to hit those elements that people are expecting. Because if you're doing a retelling, that's what they want. They want to see where are the elements that I'm familiar with and how do they show up. I will say, Ashen by H.L. Burke, that was so unique. Were you the one that published that?
That was the UP, and that was the
Okay.
one where it was really funny because we were working on our Cinderella retellings at the same time and going two different directions.
Yeah, I mean, but I loved the element of the glass slippers was very unique, and I was like, that's cool, So that's what we look for. We look for the elements and how does the author twist them and make them work. And so I'd say the source material and making sure you're hitting those elements that people expect.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree, especially with definitely don't give up. I mean, I am on like the 20th draft of my current book, and it's going to get out there. And no, it's some book. I guess like book 28 is that book for me. But it's great, and it's going to come out in July, and I'm going to do it. So that ability to stick with it. It never gets old. Okay, you're never going to outgrow that. You're never going to get to a certain place where you have to where there aren't going to be parts that you don't enjoy about this. Like that's part of putting a book is, you get to all the fun parts and all the edits, and then you have to go through and make yourself get rid of overused words. It's just, you have to have that stick with itness or you're just not going to finish it.
Right. And there are people that do write and they don't finish. Like, what is it? Like 93% of people don't finish their book. I'm like, think of all the stories out there that haven't been told because people didn't stick with it.
Yep.
So,
and then secondly, if you're doing a retelling, that is your genre box and you are choosing it. Like if you find that maybe your story isn't as close to retelling, then just leave it out. I have like a couple of books that I know the core I used was a retelling. It was a fairy tale, but it's not close enough for anyone to know it. So I don't say anything because it wouldn't help me and it wouldn't communicate accurately to the person. It just is my personal little cheat that helped me figure out the plot. And so you're allowed to do that. I'm not saying don't, base things on fairy tales, but if you're actually going to communicate that it's a fairy tale we're telling to a reader, you got to hit those beats or they're just going to ditch you. You're not, their reviews are going to be confused and cranky because you're basically not being entirely truthful about what's actually in your book.
Right.
And
I think
like that
part of that is also the happy ever after. You have to include that. That's part, and they live happily ever after. You have to include it, So a lot of people are like, oh, let's make it all angsty. No, don't do that. Don't do that.
Or if you do, warn people and be aware that people will be cranky.
Yes.
Again, we can't control what you do, but if you do it a certain way, there could be consequences. Go in knowing that there will likely be consequences for that. Okay, now it's time for the random question, which no one gets ahead of time. Like whenever I do an interview with an author, I don't tell you these. So here we go.
Okay.
You can give one character a pet penguin. Who gets it? And how do they react?
Okay. Pet penguin, the villain gets it. Vujik gets it. Because it's going to be his sidekick. He's going to make it do his dirty work and he's going to train it to it's a snowy environment. So he's going to teach it to hit all those snowy environments he can't get to because he's too big. So the pet penguin's going to be the one that goes into all these, nooks and crannies and does all his dirty work.
Wow, so we're going for psychotic penguin kind of sidekick here. I'm getting flashbacks to the most recent Wallace and Gromit movie had an evil penguin back in it, and then Madagascar had crazy penguins. There we go. That is fantastic. And this has been fantastic having you on here, Jill. So thanks for coming on the show.
It's been fun.
Now, where can people find your book online, All the Wild Hearts? Do you have any specials on it?
It is free to Kindle Unlimited users for right now. I mean, I don't know that I'm going to do this forever, but for the next month or so, it'll be free to Kindle Unlimited users, and it's on Amazon. I don't have it on any of the other Barnes and Noble or Kobo. I don't have it anywhere else. Again, this is my first foray. It's my first, I'm learning. And so for right now, getting on Amazon was a major yay moment for me. So it's available on Amazon.
Do you have anything special for our listeners at Author Culture today?
I do. I have 3 things. One is I have a short story. It was the first story that won the award for that sent me to the Realmakers Conference, called The Escort. And it's a story that's kind of close to my heart for various reasons. That's available on my website. If you use the password authorculture1, that can get you in. And then I have another short story, which it's not a fairy tale, but it's fairy tale-esque, that I had written, and called Royally Imperfect. It was with the anthology Crowns, which came out like a couple of years ago. And that's available also on my website with authorculture2 as the password. Mm-hmm. And then I also, if you want to sign up for my newsletter, I have a What Book Trope Are You quiz. And that's available through my website. So if you sign up for my newsletter.
So lots of fun, juicy freebies there. So make sure you do hop over there, listeners, and check out all the cool stuff. And where can people connect with you online and find out more what you do?
Right. I'm on Instagram as J.M. Hackman Author. That's J.M. _Hackman _author. And I'm also on Facebook. And I have my website is jmhackman.com. So you can find me there.
Mm-hmm. And I will include those links in the show notes and also in the description on this episode on YouTube. Thank you so much for hanging out with us today, Jill. And I can't wait to see your next retellings and where you go with that.
Oh, thanks. It was nice to be here. Thanks.
So we're ready to write our next science fiction fairy tale retelling, right? It's okay if not. Remember, here at Author Culture, we are all about empowering science fiction and fantasy authors just like you to take your next best steps and to make the choices that work with your unique goals and purposes. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. And do make sure that you hit that subscribe button on YouTube, on Spotify, on Substack, and hang out because we're going to have some great new episodes coming up as well with the amazing Amy Sue Williams, where we're talking about the Thunderbolts movie and how this has some interesting things to say about handling deep mental health topics in a fun and interesting way in fiction. I'm also going to have some more stuff on how to balance doing your author life with adding on services, because there was some interest in that and what it looks like to balance your writing with helping other authors. And I may even throw in a few things to help you with your summer conferences and your table selling and what that all looks like. And of course, some really great stuff for encouraging you to keep going on your amazing journey. It's a marathon, not a sprint. And I am here to help you make it to that finish line. Now go forth and be awesome.